Many thousands of Asian seamen came through Australian ports over these years, from 1924 to 1948. Chinese, Indian, Indonesian, Malays, Vietnamese, employed by local contractors in their own countries to sail on ships belonging to the big European shipping lines. They were sailing on shipping routes which many historians now describe as the muscles of the imperial system or the arteries of the imperial systems of British, French, Dutch, American capitalism. They all worked under a system of wages and conditions called Asian articles of engagement. They were in turn subdivided into Chinese, Arabic and Malay. It was a race-based system in which they got smaller wages and worse conditions than European-born sailors, but like all seamen they were subjected to strict discipline on ships under the authority of ship's captains, who another scholar calls key agents of imperialism. All foreign seamen were also bound by specific local criminal legislation. In Australia, these were the colonial and state-based Foreign Seamen's Offences Act in 1878 in Western Australia, in which disobeying the orders of a captain and leaving a ship without permission would result in 14 days or more imprisonment with hard labour in the local prison. After Federation, Asian seamen walking off the jobs and off the ship onto the land in Australia could be charged with breaching the Immigration Act. They'd be given the infamous language test, be sent to prison for 6 months, then deported. During the Second World War in Australia, national security regulations jailed foreign seamen who left their ships until they either resigned or joined another ship, and if they did neither, they were deported by the government. But if shipping routes were the arteries of the empire, they were also the arteries of growing seamen's political and trade union consciousness. There is, of course, a radical context for this as well. In China, in the context of the founding of the Kuomintang in 1911, the overthrow of the Qing dynasty and the establishment of the First Provisional Republic in 1912, and the birth of the Communist Party of China in 1921. In India, an All India Trade Union Congress began in 1920 with affiliated unions and peasant parties, and the Indian Communist Party was born in the same year. In Indonesia, the Communist Party was born in 1922. That's in 1920 as well, from smaller socialist parties and the anti-imperialist, nationalist, communist, pan-Islamist and trade union ferment of that time as well. The Chinese Seamen's Union was born in 1920 amidst this racial, radical and political context. And the KMT government made all seamen become members, which was great for the union. Indian seamen organised in city unions in 1920. Indonesian seamen organised, I'm not quite sure when, but I think it was the 1920s as well. And by 1945, all three countries had trade union branches formed and organised in Australia. The key Australian trade unions in this story were the Seamen's Union, as we've been hearing about, the Waterside Workers' Federation, or in Western Australia, the Fremantle Lumpers Union. The Seamen's Union headquarters was in Sydney, and its WA branch was affiliated with the ALP and the Fremantle District Council of the ALP, and through the 1920s was led by its secretary, and I have a very, very small drawing of him here. That's him. Thomas Horton was his name. He was a fiery man. He was expelled. His union was expelled from the Labor Party for a short while after he criticised John Curtin. For the first 5 to 10 years covered in this talk, the Australian Seamen's Union was headed by communist and international leadership of Tom Walsh. And this is a great picture. This is Tom Walsh in the middle there. This is Jacob Johnson, his offsider in the Seamen's Union. And over here is Adela Pankhurst, of the famous Pankhurst family from England. She came to Australia before the First World War, joined Vida Goldstein's famous anti-war party in Victoria, married Tom Walsh, became very involved in the early Communist Party of Australia. After about 10 years, she left the Communist Party, as did Tom. She moved right, then right, then right, then further right, until she joined the Australia First movement in World War II, a fascist body which was keen to welcome Japan to come to Australia in the war. And she was arrested and interned for a year until she was able to get out. So Tom Walsh and Jacob Johnson were both communists and internationalists. They conducted a war with overseas shipping companies, with the ALP, with conservative governments, and later between themselves. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Union was heavily factionalised, with factions centred on state capital cities, Walsh in Sydney, Johnson in Melbourne. Ultimately, both were expelled from the Union. I mean, literally and physically. They were both thrown out physically out of meetings and left the scene. The Union was almost crushed in the Great Depression and in the 1935-97 by a disastrous strike. And that's the two leaders and Adele Pankhurst. But by 1941, a new leadership led by Elliot Elliott, yes, that's his name, Elliot Elliott. He was a member of the Australian Communist Party and a proletarian internationalist. And his new leadership managed to pull the Union out of the mire, tamed the tempest of division, and he led the Seamen's Union as National Secretary from 1941 to 1973. And here's a picture of Elliot Elliott. That's him over there. And that's a great picture of the Seamen's March in one of the May Day meetings in Melbourne, in Sydney during that time. The Waterside Workers' Federation was the second major union, another union with a stormy history, this time with stevedoring companies who imposed terrible working conditions on workers. The Commonwealth Arbitration Court, which between the wars imposed a succession of brutal judgments against it, and successive Conservative Australian governments who tried to break it. In 1928, for example, the Conservative Bruce Page government introduced the Transport Workers Act, which required anybody wanting to work on the waterfront anywhere in Australia to get a licence. It became known as the Dog Collar Act, and it allowed the Commonwealth government to effectively control who worked on the wharves. In 1935, Jim Healey, who we have heard about already, was elected as General Secretary of the Union. Like Elliott, he was a communist and internationalist as well, supporting independence movements such as in Indonesia. Like Elliott, he was also an effective union leader, but he was also a pragmatist. We'll see a bit more of both of them a little later, and this is Jim Healey as a younger man. Things were different over here in Western Australia. The Fremantle Lumpers Union began in 1889, joined the National WWF in 1910, left it in 1933 and then rejoined in 1946. Always militant, it wasn't a communist-led union at this point, I don't think, because there wasn't a communist party here in those years, many of those years. But it was affiliated for a while with the ALP and the Fremantle District Council. So with that out of the way, first let's move on to a couple of pre-World War II actions by Asian seamen, in fact both by Chinese seamen. Oddly, the first involved a crew disappearing and the second involved a crew appearing unexpectedly. The first took place in December 1924 when the Chinese crew of the ship Arabian struck work for better wages and conditions and demanded a meeting with the captain. This is only 3 or so years after the Chinese Seamen's Union began. Then after meeting with officials of the Seamen's Union, they then left the ships and disappeared. And the captain called on police to arrest them for quote, being absent from the Arabian without leave. It's not known where they went, or at least no one was saying where they went, or who they stayed with, perhaps members of the Union, or perhaps the Chinese sympathisers. They appeared to have won a smashing victory with big increases in wages, so the press said, and the Arabian sailed the next day. The next strike took place in another very different context. The monster strike in 1925 by British seamen over a unilateral cut in their wages, done not just with the compliance but on the suggestion of their own union leader, Havelock Wilson, of the British National Sailors and Firemen's Unions. Crews from every British shipping line stopped work at whatever port they were in. Every major port in Australia, New Zealand and South Africa was affected, and hundreds, if not thousands, of British seamen were arrested and jailed. In Fremantle, regular processions of striking seamen marched from the harbour through the town to the Fremantle courthouse, where they were tried and, as I said, jailed. Later in the strike in Fremantle, a battle reminiscent of the Lumpers police confrontation of just 5 years before was fought between the British seamen and police down on the wharf next to the old traffic bridge. But this seems to have been born from frustration. By November the strike was over. The strike was comprehensively beaten. The Seamen's Union, as did the Fremantle District Council of the Labor Party, gave great support to the striking British seamen, initiating a strike committee at the Fremantle Trades Hall, then encouraging them to set up their own union. Its officials visited arriving ships to talk to crewmen, joined in demonstrations, meetings and marches, and found them accommodation and set up a strike fund to help pay for food. The first Fremantle people knew of the Chinese involvement was when the usual march of British seamen through the town to the courthouse to support their comrades in court was headed by 20 Chinese seamen. The local press didn't know what to make of them. Indignation, quote unquote, was expressed by onlookers, one paper wrote. Another suggested that the British strikers didn't want to march behind the Chinese strikers, and strike organisations had blundered to not recognise the, quote, strong West Australian feeling. The only stories the press ever wrote about Chinese men in Perth were about opium, smuggling and the seduction of white women, so this was something of a shock to see this group of seamen leading white seamen to a courthouse. So who were they, these apparent disruptors of white Australia? They were stokers and firemen on the British ship Demodocus, just arrived in port from the UK with 20 or 25 or so British seamen, deck workers. Almost as soon as they arrived, a large body of already striking seamen boarded the ship and persuaded them all to join the strike. Not that the press believed that. It was convinced that the British seamen had invaded the Demodocus and intimidated the crew, both British and Chinese, into leaving the ship and joining the strikers. But this wasn't what happened, as evidenced by the fact that the Chinese were at the head of the next march as well, and at other events during the strike as well, including that big confrontation later on, which they said one newspaper looked on stoically. They were lauded by Secretary Horton, who I showed a picture of a little while ago, of the Seamen's Union, who after condemning the ship's owners and Havelock Wilson in strong terms at a strike committee meeting, resolved that this meeting of seamen appreciates the decision of the crew of the Demodocus in deciding to fall in line with their comrades on this and other ports in their fight against wage reduction. And we especially thank the Chinese firemen, to whom we will give every assistance in their demand for equal pay with other seamen doing a similar class of work. And this last point is important. As if successful, it would have knocked a big hole in Asian articles as it applied to Chinese seamen. So these are the first two events that I've found in Fremantle. But some years later, 1937 in fact, sees a different stream of the way in which Australian seamen and others related to overseas seamen. And this was the industrial action boycotting shipping from Japan in 1937 over the invasion of China. This was the second invasion of China. The first one was in 1931 over Manchuria. So in 1937, in protest at this, the Chinese crew called the Silkworth walked off the ship at Newcastle, protesting both their treatment by the captain and the cargo going to the Japanese war machine. The ship stayed in Newcastle for 10 days and Australia for 5 weeks. Waterfront unions harassed it, coal trimmers refused to refuel it, and the ship was black banned by the waterfront unions. The local Trades Hall Council in Sydney welcomed and supported the crew, and they became minor celebrities in town. Treated leniently by the courts after the Silkworth left Newcastle with a volunteer crew, they left Newcastle on another ship for China shortly afterwards. This was the first shot in a battle around scrap metal and pig iron, which might give you a clue as to where this is going, for Japan. The second shot was fired here in Fremantle, when in October 1937, local Seamen's Union of Australia, Fremantle Lumpers Union and Amalgamated Engineering Union all black banned 3 Japanese whaling fleets headed for the Southern Ocean, calling it, quote, a gesture of protest against an aggressor country. The two major prongs of this campaign were banning Japanese ships and banning the sale of Japanese goods in Australian shops. The boycott lasted for 5 more months, finally being called off in March 1938 in somewhat peculiar circumstances. John Curtin, the leader of the Labor opposition in federal parliament, was asked by the then Prime Minister Joe Lyons to get the Lumpers to call off the boycott. Curtin told the men at a pickup meeting near the wharf that the boycott was putting the government in a very difficult diplomatic situation, and that if they didn't call it off, then the government would certainly use the Transport Workers Act against them. Later, Curtin refused to talk about this, instead just saying, quote, he was working in the interests of Australia and the interests of the Fremantle lumpers, and the lumpers agreed and called the boycott off. But the campaign against Japan had a fair way to go. In November 1938, wharfies at Port Kembla, Wollongong, refused to load a ship called the Dalfram with thousands of tonnes of pig iron, which the local Waterside Workers' Federation believed would be used for Japan's war in China. It was launched by the rank and file of the Waterfront Workers' Union at the local Port Kembla branch in the beginning, but once the union got on board and other union bodies gave it support, then it took off. In Perth, the local branch of the Waterside Workers' Federation donated £100 to a fundraising event, and the boycott received great publicity and support. In December of 1938, I think, the British and, quote, coloured crew of the Dalfram itself announced that they refused to sail the ship if non-unionists loaded it. In the meantime, local stevedoring companies shut the port down to any new ships, and the Commonwealth Government imposed the Transport Licensing Act on the wharfies and announced that it would be considering its own embargo on sending pig iron to Japan the next year. So in 1939, in January, Bob Menzies, the government Attorney General, arrived in Port Kembla to meet with the WWF. After long negotiations, they agreed that the export of pig iron would continue, and the men would allow the Dalfram to leave fully loaded, that the Transport Licensing Act would be suspended for the Unionists, and that two parties would discuss the export of pig iron to Japan later. At first, the Union voted the agreement down, but later changed its mind. So the Dalfram with a new crew sailed away. The shipment went, and the licence scheme was scrapped, but the government simply ignored the last point and continued the export of pig iron. Still, Menzies did get a new nickname, Pig Iron Bob, as I'm sure you would have heard. 6 Dalfram seamen were left behind when the Dalfram departed, 4 British and 2 Indians. The British were fined for being AWOL, and the two Indians went to jail for 7 days for the same offence, then another 6 months for being prohibited immigrants. 3 police charged with assaulting picketers were acquitted, and it was a kind of messy ending to a noble campaign. There was another strike by Asian seamen in Fremantle in late October 1939, a month after the beginning of World War II, this time by Indian seamen. 37 Indian seamen walked off their ships saying they wanted to go back to Calcutta and get a wartime bonus on the way. If they couldn't be taken to Calcutta, they wanted greatly increased compensation payments. Once on land, they too marched to the Fremantle police station to air their grievances and lodged a protest with the local Deputy Commissioner of Navigation. Their case was taken up again by the Seamen's Union and the Waterside Workers' Federation, who handed their case over to the Disputes Committee of the ALP's Fremantle District Council, who would be helping the men with food and accommodation. And this was significant because the ALP and its unions didn't often support Asian seamen. The strike was quickly over. An agreement was reached which promised the seamen that they could be taken to an African country, then repatriated to Calcutta, where they would be given compensation for lost work days and the promise of no victimisation. It gave the seamen what they wanted to get going home to Calcutta, because already German raiders were attacking ships in the Indian Ocean, attacking merchant marine ships in the Indian Ocean. But this was just the start of the story. For a few months of this strike, 5 more Indian crews walked off their ships in Sydney. In late November, the New South Wales government sent 100 police to arrest all the Indian seamen they could find, and all the ones they found were charged with being AWOL, convicted and jailed. By mid-November, 118 Indian seamen were in Sydney's Long Bay jail. And many of these men were Indian nationalists, telling reporters that it just wasn't right that they should be forced to do war work during an imperialist war when they were colonised by one of the participants. Ship owners and captains called them dupes of Nazis and or hostile influences, but the wider union movement joined their side, insisting that the origins of the strike was the intolerable conditions under which they worked. The SUA provided practical assistance with shelter and food, helped negotiate agreements with ship owners and captains, paid for legal assistance, and led the broader union movement to give assistance as well, as it did in Fremantle. In the end, with long jail sentences looming for remaining strikers accepted work on the new conditions or took safe repatriation to India. The last crew left Newcastle for India in late November of 1939. Now, the next episode I want to talk about, there's much more here that I can discuss in this time, but you can read it if you get a copy of Radical Perth Militant from Fremantle, if you haven't read it. And perhaps I should say at this point, if I was told by a bookseller that if you buy copies of books and you get an author to sign them, you double the value of the book straight away. So if you buy copies of that Radical Perth Militant from Fremantle, there are 3 editors here, 1, 2, and Bobby, 3. If we all signed it, that would increase the value by 300%, I think. If the book costs $40, that's $120 you should make in an instant, just like that. It's great. So later in 1941, 6 ships of the British-owned China Navigation Company, all crewed by Chinese seamen, docked in Fremantle. The relations between the seamen and their captains had deteriorated as the crews demanded higher pay and better conditions. Things were worst on a ship called the Chungking, where the crew was alleged to have seized its captain and threatened him with violence if pay rises were not forthcoming. On land, a conference between reps of the men, the captain, the shipping company's agents, the Army and the Navy, and the WA branch of the ASU were held, and they hammered out an agreement. The union recommended that the men go back to work, and a later meeting of the District Council of the ALP was full of praise for the orderly manner in which they had conducted themselves. 2 reps of the Chinese seamen attended the meeting and expressed their gratitude for the support. However, overnight, they changed their minds. And there are 2 versions of what happened next. The first by the Australian military authorities, which acted under Regulation 14A of the National Security Alien Control Regulations, which allowed governments to take any action to remove seamen from ships to prevent maritime hold-ups. 30 soldiers with rifles, bayonets and Tommy guns, machine guns, submachine guns that is, arrived on the wharf to remove the Chinese crew from all 6 ships. When the soldiers boarded the Chungking, the crew massed together and attacked them. This is the first version, I should say. The first casualty, Tong Yuan Tong, a tall Chinaman as he was described, who was the ship's quartermaster and was described as the ringleader, ran himself onto a bayonet and had then been shot. The other crewmen had tried to flee the scene and run onto another ship moored alongside, the ships being moored 3 abreast, to get to the wharf. The second casualty, Xu Ping Se, had run away from the soldiers, refused to stop when called upon, was shot in the legs and also found dead a little later. The second version, compiled by officials of the Chinese diplomatic mission in Canberra, who were on the scene pretty quickly, after discussions with the seamen, told a very different story. The crew did ask for higher wages but made no threats. After the captain called the authorities, quote, several scores of soldiers with ambulances rounded up Chinese seamen on the wharf and without warning invaded the Chungking. Believing they were about to be forced back to work, the seamen tried to force their way off the ship. At this point, the first seaman was killed and the second was shot later as he ran away from another soldier. The representative then alleged that the arrival of the soldiers was unnecessary as there was no sign of violence, that once they had arrived, they should have explained why they were there and that the shooting of the seamen was unwarrantable. Extraordinarily, the same thing happened again 3 weeks later, 6 weeks later. This was on the Dutch tanker. The Sirona arrived in Fremantle from Ceylon on the 17th of March 1942. The crew had been unsettled since stopping in Calcutta and asked the same of the captain for what the previous crew had done as well. In Fremantle, they made the same demand, and when the captain again refused, they demanded to be put off. He refused and asked the Australian military authorities to arrest the ringleader. They replied that this was a civil matter, and they wouldn't. And then he accused the ringleader with stabbing another crewman and had him arrested. After the crew demanded he be released, relations on board became uglier. The captain called a nearby Dutch minesweeper for assistance, and 14 armed sailors arrived to eject the seamen from the ship. The men refused to go, and the Dutch, after being instructed by the captain to move them by force, attacked them, bayoneting 2 more, while other men fled to a ship moored alongside, but the sailors attacked them too, wounding one and bayoneting another. Then they were finally rounded up and put on board a nearby Norwegian tanker. But another seaman, Tion Ha Kui, allegedly tried to escape. He was shot dead. 6 Chinese men were taken into military custody, although were released later. The rest returned to the tanker, but refused to sail in it. In the meantime, the Dutch authorities claimed that the men were, quote, fifth columnists and mutineers, and with the killings, that was their just deserts. There's a lot more to this story, which I haven't got in this particular episode, but the upshot of the first killings was that the so-called troublemakers were sent to a detention centre in Fremantle, and the rest were sent to the quarantine station at Woodman Point, south of Freo under guard. Of those who were sent to the detention centre, nothing is known of their later fate. Of those who were sent to Woodman Point, 81 volunteered to return to sea, but only if they were paid British pay rates. Those who stayed were drafted into the labour units of the Australian Army. There is disagreement about how this happened. One source says they volunteered, another said that it was the Seamen's Union ideas, another that they were forced to volunteer by the military, another claims it was the Chinese diplomats' idea, but I think most people think that it was Joe Byrne of the ASU, the Seamen's Union, who persuaded them to take that course of action. Either way, it seemed a good result. They were paid Australian military wages and exempted from the Australian Immigration Act. Most were eventually sent to Sydney and then to Brisbane to make barges for the Americans at even higher rates of pay, and were repatriated to China in 1945. Others stayed in Fremantle and loaded and unloaded ships at Fremantle Harbour, which is very interesting, for the war effort, while others picked potatoes near Harvey in the southwest. It's likely all these men went east as well and were repatriated as well. It was a win for the Seamen's Union as well too. When some unionists thought the arrangement was a thin end of the wedge to introduce cheap labour into Australia, the Chinese seamen assured the ASU that it wasn't. And 3 of the 6 ships, now commandeered by the government, were contracted to the US government, and the ship sailed off with Australian Seamen's Union crews. This wasn't the end of the violence and repression, though. There were other ships which presented cases to the captain about increasing in pay and better conditions. There were no more killings. There was no more violence that I know of. Well, I should have said, but I didn't. That the second case on the Dutch tanker was hit with a blanket ban by the censors in Canberra. There was no mention of whatever anywhere in the media. And with Trove, you can see this. If you know Trove, the wonderful guide motor to Australian newspapers. The first case was reported in the local news. I don't quite know the distinction, but it was. While this was all happening, an important change took place in the Seamen's Union. That's the election of Elliott in January 1941. As I said, he was a committed communist and internationalist. He was both militant and pragmatic too, and brought a long period of stability to the Union. And this was after the Communist Party, which had been banned by Menzies in 1940 and unbanned by Curtin in 1942, and there's a big story around that, of course, had reversed its opposition to the war. Importantly, he joined the government's Maritime Industry Commission, which was designed to facilitate the smooth wartime running of the maritime industry. And Jim Healy of the stevedoring industry also joined the Stevedoring Industry Commission as well, a body with the same functions, both on the understanding that they would assist the war effort, but only, as they both said, if what they were doing didn't breach union principles. While sporadic examples of industrial action continued in Fremantle, the centre of attention shifted to the eastern states, as around 3,000 Chinese and Indian seamen were stranded in major ports as ship owners sought sanctuary from attacks in the safety of the ports. Stranded in those ports, seamen began to agitate again for higher wages and better conditions, and not to be sent home through what had become deadly seas, with Japanese submarines and raiders everywhere, as it established its hold on Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Asian seamen, well aware that they were subject to both the legislation I talked about and to the Immigration Act, left their ships and scattered hiding among the city's buildings and trades hall buildings, union families, sheds, warehouses, or sheltered by other Chinese people. And most of the stranded seamen were Chinese. After the arrest and jailing of many of these striking seamen on January the 22nd in 1943, the leaders of the strikers and the Seamen's Union leaders organised and created an Australian branch of the Chinese Seamen's Union, with the President and Secretary of the Seamen's Union in attendance. Branches in Melbourne and Brisbane followed later in 1943, and there was no branch in Perth, probably because by this time, practically all the Chinese seamen had been relocated to Sydney and Melbourne. And this is a picture of a Seamen's Union meeting in Sydney, probably about 1943. And the stoppages continued, irritating the Australian government no end. So much so it set up an inquiry in 1944 into Chinese wages and conditions as to what to do. Amazingly, it recommended 1. The equivalence to Australian pay and conditions, improved compo and danger money for foreign workers. 2. Changes to national security regulations, allowing striking seamen to do other onshore work in Australia at Australian pay and conditions. 3. Suspension of the Immigration Act, so they had free movement around Sydney and Brisbane. So Chinese seamen did much valuable work for Australia in the US militaries, plus on Australian public works and infrastructure. And the Chinese Seamen's Union found work for Chinese seamen around Sydney, organised among other Chinese seamen for better wages and conditions on ships, and one increases up in ordinary employment to Australian Seamen's Union members' levels. In 1943, the entire membership of the CSU, the Chinese Seamen's Union branch, was transferred to Brisbane for work. By 1943, the presence of Chinese workers was now so common on the Sydney industrial front that they were invited to march under their own banners in 4 May Day processions in Sydney. In 1943, 1944, 1945, where they were joined by Indian seamen, and 1946, where they were joined by Indonesian seamen as well, who formed the Indonesian Seamen's Union in 1944. It was quite a coming together, quite a sense of solidarity in this important celebration of an international working class. The Indonesian Seamen's Union demonstration, which is the next slide I want to show, I think was from about probably 1946. And I can't read what's down there, so I can't tell you. But it's on a stage in Sydney.
Wynyard, Indonesian seamen speaking at a pro-Indonesian demo in Wynyard Square.
Well done, Peter, thank you.
I need new glasses.
These May Day processions were associated, of course, with the Communist Party and held on the traditional celebration of the International Labour Movement on May the 1st each year. The mainstream Labour movement didn't celebrate on this particular day. It celebrated 6 Hours Day, yes, 6 Hours Day, and later Labour Day on the first Monday in October, with huge processions through the city streets. In 1945, one group marched in support of Indonesian independence but didn't repeat the May Day invitations. In 1946, though, all the industrial advances made in Australia for Asian seamen was reversed after the war. The Maritime Industry Commission was shut down, and when Asian seamen went home, British and American shipping lines simply restored the Asian articles to their previous status, and Asian seamen's pay and conditions returned to pre-World War II level. And the Chinese Seamen's Union in Sydney collapsed in the face of a rapidly declining membership as Chinese seamen returned home. Yet there was one more episode to go in which Asian and Australian unions took part, and this is probably the most famous one. And there's a lovely little film called Indonesia Calling, if you want to have a look at it online. It's online on YouTube. The campaign in support of Indonesian independence. After the surrender of Japan, which brought World War II to an end, the new Indonesian Republican movement set up a republican government in parts of Indonesia and declared independence in the terms set out in that famous third clause of the Atlantic Charter, the agreement between the USA and Great Britain in August 1941 about the future of the post-war world. And it read like this: Third, they, Britain and the US, respect the rights of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to all those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Unfortunately, as Churchill, who signed the document with the American President Roosevelt, soon forcibly stated he wasn't going to give India away to anybody. and the clause only applied to states seized by Germany, Italy and Japan during the war. And several countries with claims on somebody else's land agreed. Pretty soon the Republicans in Indonesia found themselves in armed conflict with Great Britain, which was managing Japan's surrender and intent on restoring the international order after the war. Outgunned, the Republican nationalist forces lost heavily when the Dutch sent large numbers of troops, largely from Australia, who'd been living in Australia, to Indonesia, and then later in 1948 and 49, I think, conducted what they called police actions, which you hear language about similarly in Gaza today, against the Indonesian soldiers. But over the next 4 years, bloody and valiant resistance wore the Dutch down until 1949, the Dutch, seeing the inevitable and pressured by the UN and several nations, including Australia, but primarily by the US, handed Indonesia over to the Republican government. And just a matter of interest, the US government refused to provide any money to the Dutch government anywhere unless they gave Indonesia independence. The Dutch had set up a government in exile in Australia after its defeat by Japan, and the Australian government gave it extraterritorial rights over areas it had settled in, which included Dutch ships in Australian ports. It brought with it large numbers of troops and hundreds of Indonesian political prisoners, which it interned at a kind of prison camp at Casino in New South Wales to stop them joining the nationalist side back in Indonesia. It also brought many unhappy Indonesian seamen with them to add to the ones who were already in Australia. And in April 1942, they struck against the Dutch and went back to their Dutch ships with new and better conditions. Unfortunately for the Dutch, much of its shipping was tied up in Australian ports, some vessels commandeered by the Australian government, others sheltering from enemy action, notably in Sydney and Brisbane. And after the war and the return of the Dutch to Indonesia, they began shipping arms, the Dutch, and ammunition and other materials to Indonesia to fight the Republican forces. And World War II ended on the 2nd of September 1945. On the 9th of September 1945, in Melbourne, Indonesian seamen walked off 6 ships carrying officials and troops back to Indonesia. Then the Waterside Workers' Federation in New South Wales black banned the first Dutch ships carrying arms to the Dutch. Then in October, the Brisbane Waterside Workers' Federation refused to load the ships. Other waterfront unions in Sydney and the Brisbane Labour Councils, that's the collective body, endorsed their decisions. Indonesian and Indian seamen, instructed by their own union, formed in 1945, continued to refuse to work on Dutch ships as the boycott movement spread all around Australia. All in all, in 1945, 559 vessels and 1,000 land craft had been identified as being affected by the ban of the 31 trade unions involved in the boycott. It was a very, very substantial ban. If you want to know what all these ships were doing, read a book called The Black Armada, and the author I've forgotten the name of temporarily because he describes all these numbers. Rupert Lockwood, yeah. Thank you. So what was happening in Fremantle at the time? Fremantle was much smaller. The campaign against Dutch ships in Fremantle was much smaller than it was in Sydney and Brisbane. There were relatively small numbers of union involved. They were the Waterside Workers' Federation, the Fremantle Lumpers Union, which, as I said earlier, was separate from the Waterside Workers' Federation until 1946. The Seamen's Union, the Fremantle Coastal Dock, Rivers and Harbour Workers' Union, the Dockies, Paddy Troy's Union, the AEU for a short time in late 1945, and the Carpenters and Joiners Union. The ALP had forbidden its attendant unions from both holding up Dutch ships and joining a movement that many of the opponents of the Dutch in Indonesia had set up called the Free Indonesia Movement, on the grounds that both were communist inspired. The relations between the two were very bad, the Communist Party and the Labour Party. Most of the waterfront unions were not in the ALP and were free to do what they wanted, but the Carpenters Union was, and fought a long battle against being disaffiliated by the party. In Western Australia, the first black bans on Indonesian ships was in November 1945, when the Dockies and the Carpenters Union refused to work on the Dutch submarine, the Tiger Hull, otherwise known as Tiger Shark. Then in 1946, the Lumpers Union, which had left the Waterside Workers' Federation in 1933, loaded a ship called the Tasman with WA flour for Indonesia, which had been banned by the Sydney WWF. But after elections in 1946, the FLU's leaders were toppled and a new leadership ticket elected, which took it back into the WWF and into the campaign again. So they banned the Tasman after that. Another ship was the Bonaire, which was black banned in April 1946 by wharfies and tugboat crews from the dockies, and again in 1947 when it came back unwisely to Fremantle. Then in June 1946, another ship, the naval vessel Piet Hein, which I saw, Peter, on one of the newspaper clippings on your screen, just to show how contemporary things are happening, was banned in Sydney and Brisbane and Fremantle too, where the Carpenters Union and the WWF refused to work it. And there was one more. On August the 6th, during a break in the bans, a ship called the Report was loaded with goods, made it to Gage Roads, where it stayed for several weeks waiting for a crew. From then on, the black bans went on and off, depending largely on what the Dutch military was doing in Indonesia. And from later 1945, civic groups like Hands Off Indonesia, campaigning too on one occasion, showing Indonesia calling to an enthusiastic audience in Fremantle. On May Day celebrations of the WA branch of the Communist Party featured the film, and so did small and enthusiastic demonstrations elsewhere. And perhaps it's these people on the wharf at Fremantle who booed and hooted a ship docked in Freo with 1,600 troops on board bound for Indonesia. I think that must have been about late 1938. So what about the effectiveness of this boycott? Nobody has claimed that the boycott won the war for Indonesia. Every source I've seen in this said the Indonesians won the war themselves, but all agree that the boycotts bought breathing space for Republicans to build military forces and infrastructure and help raise the future of Indonesia as an international issue. Many things can be said, and these are just four which I've picked out. In all of these campaigns, they show a profound kind of internationalism on the part of the unions involved, the Australian unions, almost invariably the maritime unions, but others as well. But of the many kinds of internationalism that there are, this was, I think, a proletarian internationalism. It supports the argument from some historians who claim that Chinese, Indian and Indonesian seamen went from being, quote, coolish to comrades of Australian maritime workers. It also shows that the common argument by older historians that the labour movement was at this point thoroughly racist is wrong. It also shows that many Australians were early on prepared to support independence movements in these colonies close to Australia. And I might just add that hearing Peter talking about the Seamen's Union and apartheid, the Seamen's Union opposed every one of Australia's foreign wars up until Vietnam, and maybe since, when I lost track of their story. They're an incredible union. They were an incredible union. They're now part of the MUA.